Montana Territory, late spring of 1882. The wind tore down from the mountains like it was angry, rattling the windows of the small station house in the dry town of Clearwater Ridge. Xavier Truett stood on the platform, hat pulled low, boots planted, as the afternoon train hissed to a stop in a cloud of steam and dust. He searched the line of passengers, his heart giving a sudden, hard thump when he saw her. She was thinner than her letters had suggested, her shoulders squared but cautious, lips pressed tight. Her clothes were plain and worn, her gloved hands clutching a carpet bag like it was the only solid thing left in her life. Her name was Hester Duvall, and she looked like she had walked through hell to get here. The conductor helped her down with a nod, but no one else approached her. The townsfolk who had gathered to gawk whispered just loud enough for Xavier to hear. "That's the one, right? The damaged one from Missouri. Lost her family in a fire. They say she stopped talking for weeks. Poor man. Could have had any girl. Why her?" Xavier ignored them. He stepped forward, took his hat off, and said in a voice steady and warm, "Miss Duvall? I'm Xavier Truett." She looked up at him, and for a moment her eyes didn't quite meet his. Then she gave a small nod. "I remember your handwriting." He smiled, just a little. "Welcome to Clearwater Ridge." They rode back to his ranch in silence, the wagon creaking over the rutted trail. Hester sat straight, her hands never letting go of that bag. The ranch came into view sprawled over the foothills' weathered barn, two-room house, and fenced pasture stretching toward the tree-line. Two children came running from the barn as soon as the wagon rolled in. A girl with wild curls and a boy with a slingshot tucked into his belt. "Daddy," they shouted in unison. Xavier helped Hester down before turning to scoop them both into his arms. "You two behaved today?" "Daisy chased the chickens again," the boy said proudly. "Did not," the girl snapped. Xavier chuckled, setting them down. "Hester, this is Dorian and Daisy. My twins." Hester blinked. "They weren't mentioned in your letters." His smile faded just a bit. "No. Their mother left 2 years ago. Rode off with a peddler passing through Helena. No word since." Hester's eyes dropped to the children, who peered curiously at her. She gave them a small, uncertain nod. "Hello." Dorian frowned. "Are you going to be our new ma?" Xavier cleared his throat. "Let's give her time." Inside the house, Hester stood awkwardly in the doorway while Xavier lit the stove. The smell of stew filled the air. Daisy tugged at Hester's skirt, eyes wide. "You look real pretty." Hester looked down at her. "Thank you." After dinner, Xavier stepped out with his rifle to check the fence line. When he returned, Hester was sitting on the porch swing, arms wrapped around herself, eyes on the darkening sky. He sat beside her. The silence stretched. "I know what they say," she said finally. "About me. I do not care what they say. I was supposed to marry a man in Springfield. He died before I got there. House fire. His sister pulled me out. I lost everything in that fire. Mama. My little brother. I stopped talking because I did not know how to say goodbye." Xavier took a slow breath. "You do not owe me an explanation. I want to work for my keep," she said, her voice firm. "I know how to sew, clean, and milk. I do not want to be someone you feel sorry for." He turned to her. "I do not feel sorry for you." She looked at him then. Really looked. "Then what do you feel?" He hesitated. "Grateful you came. And mad at every fool who ever called you damaged when you were standing right here, stronger than any of them." Her eyes shimmered, but she blinked fast and looked away. "I do not know how to be anyone's wife anymore." "Then we will not rush it," he said. "We will take it one day at a time." The next morning, Hester helped the children with chores. She braided Daisy's hair while Daisy chattered about the baby goats and showed Dorian how to patch the rip in his shirt. She moved through the house like someone trying not to take up too much space, but the children followed her like shadows. By the end of the week, she was rising with the sun, baking bread, and helping Xavier tend the livestock. They worked side by side, not saying much, but something easy started to take root between them: quiet glances, shared laughter, the kind of silence that felt full instead of empty. One afternoon, when a storm rolled in fast, Xavier found her in the barn calming a spooked mare. Lightning cracked, and the horse reared. Hester stepped forward without hesitation, speaking low and steady until the animal settled. Xavier stared at her. "You afraid of anything?" She looked at him, rain dripping from her lashes. "Yes, but I do not let it stop me." He stepped closer, water running down his face. "You are not damaged, Hester. You are brave." She swallowed hard. "Do not say that unless you mean it." "I mean it." She looked up at him, the space between them small, the barn warm with hay and breath and something else. Then Daisy called for them from the house, and the moment passed. But the feeling stayed. Over the next few weeks, the town kept whispering. Some said she would leave. Others said she was using him. Hester never responded. She just kept working, loving the children in her quiet way, and building something steady with Xavier, something real. One evening, after supper, she was drying her hands when he came in from the porch and said, "Would you walk with me?" They walked past the fence line, into the meadow where wildflowers swayed. The sky was streaked with orange. "I thought I came here because I had no choice," she said. "And now, I chose to stay." He reached for her hand. "I am glad you did." She looked up at him, her voice barely above a breath. "So am I." And when he leaned in, and she met him halfway, it was not rushed or fiery. It was quiet and sure, like something that had been waiting a long time to bloom. Neither of them said the words yet, but they did not need to. Not tonight. They just stood there, hand in hand, in the golden light, knowing what was coming. And for both of them, it finally felt like home. The wind had softened by June. Morning light slanted gentle through the cottonwoods, and the air smelled of damp earth and late lilacs. Hester stood barefoot in the garden, hands sunk deep in the furrows between the rows of chard and turnips. A bumblebee hovered near her wrist, fat and slow. She didn't flinch. From the porch, Xavier watched her kneeling there, sleeves rolled past her elbows, hair tied up in a kerchief. She wasn't rushing the planting. She moved with patience, pressing each seed like it deserved its place. He stepped down the stairs, wiping his palms on his trousers. "You ever work a root cellar before?" "No," she said, brushing dirt from her hands. "But I can learn." The last one gave way during a thaw. "I'm digging it deeper this time. Could use another set of eyes. I keep seeing slope where there ought to be level." She followed him without question. The site sat beyond the chicken coop, half shadowed by a line of wind-stunted pines. The pit was halfway dug, walls uneven. She crouched beside it and traced a line in the earth with a stick. "This side's falling inward. You'll lose the corner if rain hits too hard." He crouched beside her. "That's what I thought. You trust me with this?" "I'd be a fool not to." She looked at him, then back to the soil. "My uncle used to bury barrels in the ground to keep apples and onions through winter. We'd dig with hands when we didn't have tools." He leaned on his shovel. "Where was that?" "Osage land, south of the Missouri border. My father traded pelts. My mama taught school." Xavier didn't speak for a moment. "You never told me that." "I never thought to," she said. "Till now." Later that day, Dorian came running in from the pasture, cheeks flushed. "There's a man at the fence. Says he's from the church in town. He wants Pa." Xavier didn't take time to clean his hands. He stepped out, found Reverend Sims waiting by the gate, his white collar damp with sweat. "Got a moment?" the Reverend asked, eyes flicking toward the house. Xavier didn't answer right away. "If it's about Hester, say it plain." Sims shifted. "Some in the congregation are concerned. She's not from here. She carries burdens." Xavier crossed his arms. "So do I. She sits quiet through service. Doesn't kneel. Doesn't sing. She listens." The Reverend hesitated. "There's talk that she might not be right for a Christian home." Xavier's voice cooled. "She's right for mine." Sims gave a stiff nod, then turned back toward his mule cart and left with the dust rising behind him. When Xavier returned, he found Hester at the kitchen table, mending Dorian's sock. She didn't look up. "I heard," she said. "I didn't tell him anything." "I wasn't baptized," she said. "My mother believed in God, but not in churches." She said no place built by men could hold something that big. He sat across from her. "Do you believe?" She tied off the thread, clipped it with the small shears. "I believe in the way Daisy laughs from her belly. In the way you hold a horse's reins like you're listening to it. In the way grief doesn't drown us, even when it wants to." He reached across the table, covered her hand with his. "That's enough for me." The next morning, she rose before the sun, not to bake or tend the garden, but to ride. Xavier found her saddling the gelding. She glanced at him, eyes steady. "I need to see the ridge, the one to the west. You said it was good for thinking." He nodded once. "I'll watch the children." She rode alone, coat flapping behind her, braid tucked under her hat. The trail climbed slow, switchbacks winding through the pines. At the top, she dismounted and sat on a flat stone, knees drawn up, watching the land stretch wide and green below. She stayed until the light changed. When she returned, the children ran to her without hesitation. Daisy tugged her hand, dragging her toward the loom Xavier had built weeks ago. "Show me how to weave again," she said. "The way you did with the string and the stick." Hester knelt beside her. "It's a shuttle," she said gently. "And that's the warp. Let's try again." Xavier stood in the doorway as twilight deepened. Her voice drifted to him, low and patient, guiding the child's hands. That night, after the children had gone to bed, she stepped outside, arms wrapped around herself. The stars were out, bright through the clear sky. He joined her without speaking. "I used to think," she said quietly, "that I'd never belong anywhere again. Not after the fire. Not after being passed from cousin to cousin, town to town. Every place I landed, someone looked at me like I was just ashes waiting to scatter." He didn't interrupt. "But your children, they don't look at me like that. And you don't either. I see a woman who keeps trying, even when everything told her to stop." She looked over at him. "I never thanked you for not asking me to be anything but what I am. You don't owe me thanks, Hester. You just owe yourself peace." She stepped closer. "I'm starting to find it. Here." He reached out then, touched her cheek with the backs of his fingers. "You can have all of it." She leaned into his touch, not desperate, not uncertain, just sure. And in the hush between them, something deepened. Something steady and real, like the roots of the cottonwoods lining the creek, unseen but strong. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. By mid-July, the sun baked the hills until the grass turned brittle underfoot. The creek that ran behind the barn had thinned to a trickle, the water sluggish around polished stones. Hester stood at the edge of it one morning, skirts hiked to her calves as she rinsed a basin and watched a crawdad skitter beneath a flat rock. Her arms were brown from the sun now, the skin along her forearms freckled and taut from long days outside. Behind her, Xavier's boots crushed dry weeds. "You've done something to the place," he said. "Feels different lately." She wrung out the rag she was using, twisting it slow. "I haven't changed anything that matters." "You have, though," he said. "The air sits easier. The children sleep through the night." She turned, water dripping from the rag onto her boots. "They didn't before?" "Not since their mother left." He didn't say more, and she didn't ask. Some things had sharp edges still. That afternoon, a rider came up the path dragging a mule behind him, its back leg dragging. The man was tall with a stitched-up cheek and a rifle slung over his back. He introduced himself as Emery Glass, a cattle hauler headed east who'd lost his trail north of the ridge. "She stepped in a hole," he said, nodding to the mule. "Won't carry another load. Thought I'd ask if you had a beast to spare or a place to lay over." Xavier looked to Hester, then back to the man. "You can water her and camp by the barn, but I don't sell stock." The man nodded. "Appreciate it." That night, around the fire behind the house, Emery shared biscuits from his pack and talked about the blizzard that took 6 heads of cattle outside Cheyenne the winter before. Xavier listened while Hester kept her hands busy mending Dorian's overalls. The children had been sent to bed, but Daisy had begged to sleep near the fire, curled in a blanket with her thumb in her mouth. Hester let her. Emery turned to her after a while. "You're not from here." "No, didn't think so. You've got a flatland way of sitting. Like you're still bracing for wind." Xavier rose then, tossing the last of his coffee out into the dirt. "You've had your supper. No need to press her." Emery held up a hand. "Didn't mean offense." "You took none," Hester said. "But you're right. I brace when I don't have to." Later, when the fire had burned low and Emery was settled in the barn loft, Xavier joined her on the back steps. She was shelling peas into a tin bowl, the sound soft and steady. "I don't like men like that around the children," he said. "He's passing through." Still, she glanced at him. "You've seen worse than him. I can tell." His jaw shifted. "Saw a man shoot his own brother over a crate of spoiled peaches once. Dried fruit shipment gone bad. They hadn't spoken in 3 years, and that was the first thing they said to each other." She set the bowl down. "What happened after?" "Sheriff let him ride out. Said if a man can draw that fast over something that small, he didn't want to see what he'd do for something that mattered." She looked at him hard, then asked, "And what would you do if someone threatened your children?" His voice dropped. "I'd die standing." She didn't speak after that, just nodded once and leaned her shoulder against his, quiet again. The next morning, Emery left with a limp in his mule and a nod of thanks, but Xavier kept his rifle nearer than usual for the next few days. Hester didn't ask why. She started checking the windows before she went to bed. When the first rain in weeks finally came, it came heavy. It beat the roof in waves, turned the yard to muck. Dorian and Daisy pressed their palms to the windows, laughing as the wind threw pine needles against the glass. That night, thunder cracked loud enough to shake the walls. Xavier found Hester in the pantry, lighting a lantern. "Something wrong?" he asked. "I woke and couldn't find the lamp," she said. The dark was too thick. He reached for her hand. "You're not alone here." She didn't pull away. "I know, but sometimes it still feels like I am." He didn't answer, just pulled her gently to him, resting his chin on her crown. She stood stiff at first, then softened, her arms coming around his waist. When she spoke again, her voice was low. "I keep waiting for it to be taken away. This steadiness." He held her tighter. "It won't be. Not by me." And something settled between them then, not loud or sudden, but firm, like a stone fitted into place where it had always belonged. The next day, she took the children with her to the edge of the pasture and showed them how to track deer prints in the soft earth. Daisy called it quiet walking, and Hester laughed not loud, but full. Xavier watched them from the porch, the laughter carrying back to him on the breeze. He leaned against the post, hands in his pockets, and for the first time in years, he let himself believe that the past didn't have to follow them forever. Later, as dusk bled into the sky, Hester came to him with dirt on her skirt and a calm in her eyes. "I'd like to stay," she said. "Not just until summer ends. Not as a guest." He nodded once. "Then you will." And that was all that needed saying. The morning of their wedding came quiet, without fanfare. No bells, no procession, just the sound of a saw whetting against bark as Xavier trimmed the last slat for the porch railing. Hester stood inside, her back to the mirror, fastening the final buttons on a borrowed dress cream-colored cotton with lace worn thin at the cuffs. Daisy had found it in a trunk behind the church and insisted it was meant for her. "You look like you belong in one of those stories where the lady walks through a field and everyone stops to watch," Daisy had whispered. Hester hadn't known what to do with that, so she'd kissed the girl's forehead and pulled her close. Now, as she stepped onto the porch with her hands folded, Xavier looked up from the rail and straightened. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he laid the saw aside and wiped his palms on his trousers. "I would have built something finer if I'd known you'd be stepping out here like that." She shook her head. "This is enough." Reverend Sims arrived late and alone, his coat flapping in the wind. He didn't offer a sermon. They stood under the pine Xavier had planted the year the twins were born, and the only witnesses were the children and the dog that kept trying to nose at Hester's hem. When Sims asked for vows, Xavier didn't hesitate. "I promise to keep this place steady. I promise not to speak when silence is kinder, and I promise to look for you first when the day ends." Then he looked at her, and she said, "I promise to stay. I promise to listen even when I don't have words. And I promise to let the past rest behind us." Sims nodded once and closed his book. "Then you're married." Dorian let out a whoop and threw a handful of grain into the air, which Daisy had mistaken for rice. The wind scattered it across the yard, and the dog lunged after it, barking. Afterward, they didn't hold a gathering or a supper. Instead, Xavier brought out the last jar of wild plum preserves, and Hester cut thick slices of bread over the stove. They ate at the table with their sleeves rolled and their boots still dusty. "I didn't expect this to feel so calm," she said, pouring him coffee. "That's how I know it's right," he said. That night, the children stayed with Mrs. Everly down the road, who had raised 6 of her own and didn't blink when Xavier asked. Inside the bedroom, Hester took her time unpinning her hair. Xavier waited by the window, watching the branches shift in the breeze. Neither of them rushed. When she turned, he stepped forward, and there was no uncertainty in the way he reached for her, no hesitation in the way she leaned into him. In the stillness that followed, lying together with their hands clasped under the quilt, she whispered, "I didn't think I'd ever belong to anyone again." "You don't," he said. "You belong with me, not to me." She closed her eyes. "That's better." The next weeks passed in the rhythm of a new kind of quiet. not the silence of grief or waiting, but of living. They planted late beans and stacked hay in the loft before the storms could catch it. Hester taught Daisy to card wool and stitched new curtains for the front windows out of flour sacks. Xavier took Dorian fishing and came back with stories about a trout that snapped the line and got away. One evening, while oiling the hinges on the barn door, Xavier found Hester sitting on the fence with a ledger in her lap. "You keeping books now?" he asked, wiping his hands. "I wanted to see what it costs to keep the place running through winter," she said, not looking up. "We'll need more kindling than last year. And the west eaves still leak." He stepped closer, peering over her shoulder. "You've got a head for this." "My father taught me numbers before I could read," she said. "He said folks forget that a woman ought to know how to count what she's worth." Xavier leaned a hand on the rail. "And what do you count yourself now?" She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "Not owed, not broken, just full." He nodded. "That's what I see." They didn't speak again that evening. Just watched the sun lower behind the ridge, side by side, the barn casting long shadows across the grass. Autumn crept in slow, with frost edging the windows at dawn and the geese flying low over the hills. The mornings turned brisk, and the nights held a kind of hush that made the world feel close-wrapped and sturdy. One night, as they lay in bed listening to the wind slip through the boards, Hester said, "Do you think the children remember her?" "She's a name they don't say anymore," Xavier replied. "But do you?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I remember what I hoped she'd be. Not what she was." Hester turned toward him. "And now," he ran his thumb along the inside of her wrist. "Now I don't have to hope. I just have to wake up next to you." She pressed her forehead to his shoulder and let the quiet settle around them like a blanket. They didn't talk about the past after that, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer needed tending. And when winter came, with its long nights and hard winds, the house stayed warm. Not from the fire alone, but from the life they'd built, steady and whole. Nothing had been rushed. Nothing had come easy. But it had lasted, and that was enough. A slow snow began falling in late November, light at first, then steady, brushing the tops of the split-rail fence and softening the creak of the barn's weathered door. Hester stood near the hearth, turning the drying rack so the wool socks would take the heat evenly. Behind her, Xavier was running a whetstone along his draw knife, working by the kitchen window where the light was best. "You've never said what you wanted for your birthday," he said, not looking up. She shifted the rack an inch to the left. "I stopped counting them after I left Missouri." "Well," he said, setting the blade aside, "then I'll call this your first one here." She leaned her hip against the table and crossed her arms. "I'm not sure I'd want anything." "I'm not asking what you need," he replied. "I'm asking what you want." She thought for a moment, then said, "There's a stretch of land just beyond the south pasture. Birch trees grow there, thin and silver. I want a bench there, big enough for two." Xavier smiled not with his mouth, but with the tilt of his head and the softening around his eyes. "Then you'll have it." They spent the next days readying the house for winter in earnest. The cellar had held through the summer rains, just as she'd planned, and the shelves inside stood lined with jars of beans, tomatoes, pickled onions, and apples and syrup. Dorian had taken to checking the traps near the creek at first light, while Daisy gathered needles from the forest floor to twist into fragrant bundles for under their pillows. One morning, Hester found Xavier hunched at the workbench in the barn, smoothing the slats of something wide and low. "You're making it now?" she asked. He brushed sawdust from the frame. "I figured you'd want to see it come together." She stepped closer, ran her fingers along the edge. "You always work things out with your hands." "Harder to lie to wood," he said. She laughed softly. "You ever lie to people?" "I used to," he said, "when I was younger and thought the truth cost more than it was worth. And now I know better." On the first Sunday of December, the four of them rode into town in the wagon, bundled in coats and scarves stitched from old feed sacks. The church was holding a winter gathering, no sermon, just singing, mulled cider, and a table of baked goods that stretched the length of the hall. Hester stood by the stove near the back, watching Daisy bend over a tin of gingerbread while Dorian traded stories near the window. A woman she didn't recognize approached with a dish of sweet potatoes balanced on her hip. "You're the one married to Truett," the woman said. "I am. You've done something kind to him." He used to come into town with his shoulders all bunched up, like he was waiting to be hit. Hester folded her hands together. And now he looks like he's got somewhere to go home to. They didn't stay long. The snow had started again by early evening, and the road back was narrow and slick. Hester sat close to Xavier beneath the blanket, the children curled half asleep against their sides. The moon lit the trail in patches where the clouds broke, and for a while, no one spoke. Just before the house came into view, she leaned against him. I used to think warmth was a thing you had to buy or beg for. He rested his hand over hers. And now I know it can be built. That night, after the children had been tucked in, Hester opened the small drawer in the sewing cabinet and pulled out a square of linen she'd been embroidering since the first frost. It wasn't fine, just their initials stitched in dark blue, the thread tight and even. She turned it over in her hands once, then laid it on his pillow. The next morning, she found it sewn into the inside of his coat. By the time the last of the snow melted in March, she had a rhythm to the days that felt like it had always been there. She planted early lettuces, taught Daisy to braid bread with a soft egg wash, and helped Dorian build a slingshot that wouldn't snap under tension. Xavier repaired the gate to the far pasture and started carving a chest set from the offcuts of pine left by the barn. One afternoon, she found him crouched beneath the birch trees, setting the last wooden slat into place on the bench. He stood as she approached and brushed his hands clean on his trousers. "It's wide enough," he said, and I leveled the ground underneath. She sat first, running her palm along the grain. "It'll gray with weather. Everything honest does," he said, lowering himself beside her. They sat together, watching the wind stir the tops of the trees. Hester turned toward him, her voice soft. "I thought love had to come loud, with promises and declarations." He didn't move, just looked at her. "And now I know it comes like this. Quiet, certain, like knowing where the sun will rise." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Then let it rise here. Every day." She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "It already has." The bench held them both steady as the wind whispered through the birch leaves, and the sun dipped behind the ridge, golden and unhurried. Years passed. The house weathered, and so did they, in the way of people who had lived well. The twins grew, Dorian taller than his father by 20, Daisy with hands quick enough to catch a falling egg midair. They both married in time, building homes not far from the ridge. Hester's hands grew stiffer with age, but she still stitched by the window, still baked bread that filled the house with warmth. Xavier's hair silvered, his back bent a little more each spring, but he never stopped carving, never stopped waking early to walk the land he had once tended alone. Every evening, they sat on the bench beneath the birch trees. Some nights they spoke, some nights not, but always they were together. And in all the quiet years that followed, not once did she forget the way he had looked at her that first day, like she was a place he could stop running. She had been, and he had never left.